Hello and welcome back to Conquering Finale. My name is Jason Lafredo. We are continuing with the Acing Articulations category, and this is part 2 of the Articulation Designer series. And this is specifically dealing with playback. So let me just show you where that is in the Articulation Designer. I'm going to choose to edit my staccato for a second here. And in the right-hand section of the Articulation Designer, you'll see a section for playback effect. And there's a few options in this pull-down menu. The first of which is none, and if that's selected, then obviously there will be no playback effect. And we can change the attack, we can change the duration, and we can change the key velocity. Now, in the case of the staccato, the duration is selected because a staccato would be a durational type of articulation, right? If I were to select the accent, you'd see that key velocity is selected because it's going to be an accented note, right? And then change attack, by the way, will pretty much exclusively be used for rolls. So I'll get to that later in this video in a few minutes. But let's actually start with key velocity. So let me duplicate my accent here. Edit this new one. So we've got key velocity selected for the playback effect. Now we have some values here of top note value and bottom note value, and then a check for values as percentage. Now the top note value and the bottom note value have to do with chords. So if you have this particular articulation on a chord, Finale can discern differences between the playback of the bottom note value versus the top note, right? So we can change, if these notes are different, if these numbers are different, what Finale will do is play the bottom note. You know, if we made this 100%, the bottom note would be played at 100% key velocity. The top note would be played at 125%, and any note in between would be calculated between depending on how many notes there are. So this, if there's 4 notes, it would be like what 108, 116, 125, or something like that, right? And then let's talk about the value as percentage. With key velocity and duration, 99.9% of the time, you're going to want to have values as percentages checked. And basically what that does is just what it sounds like. So with the key velocity, you're making it 125% of the base key velocity. Now the base key velocity is set in your playback controls, and by default, it's set to 64. So 125% of 64 would give you a new key velocity for that particular note where that articulation exists, right? The value of having percentages like this is that with dynamics, the dynamics will actually change that base key velocity. So if you put in a forte, for example, it changes from 64 to like 76 or something, I think, or 80 or something. And so then the 125% goes on top of that base key velocity, right? So it is scalable depending on the particular dynamic that you have in effect, right? If you were to uncheck this value as percentage, these numbers become additive now. So you're adding to that base key velocity these numbers. Now, with a number like 125, it's almost nonsensical because the key velocities only go from 0 to 127. So if you add 125 to 64, you're going to get 127 because it'll max out. So if you have this unchecked, first of all, you'd have to have much smaller numbers here, like 20, for example. But then it's not scalar, you know what I mean? Because 20 on top of a 40 base key velocity with a piano marking is going to be a lot higher than 20 plus 80 if it's a forte, you know what I mean? So again, it makes much more sense to keep this value as percentage for key velocities, right? But the option does exist if you want to do that. In fact, you know, it could be useful, you know, to uncheck that and just put these numbers at 127 if you want that accent to always hit that particular note at 127 key velocity no matter what. You know, that would be one use for unchecking that, I guess. And then so let's talk about duration. So let's go back and duplicate my staccato. I'll show you a few things about duration. Change duration is checked with a staccato, and again, values as percentage. Now this is almost more critical to have the values as percentages checked, because when you uncheck this, these numbers now become EDU values, and the EDU value, if you know anything about it, is that 1024 would be a quarter note, 256 would be 16th note, 512 is an 8th note, etc. So when you have that unchecked, basically what you're doing is you're setting the duration to that value. So if I were to set this to 256, it doesn't matter what note this articulation is on, the duration will be an EDU of 256 or a 16th note. So that doesn't make a lot of sense with a staccato because, if you put this type of staccato on a quarter note, that quarter note is going to become a 16th. An eighth note is going to become a 16th. A 16th is going to become a 16th, which would effectively have no change to the duration to it, right? So again, more sense to have values as percentage for the duration, right? And finale's default for the staccato is actually 40%. And again, if you don't like that, if it's too short or too long, you can change that depending on what you need. And interestingly, you can actually make these numbers higher than 100%. If you were to put this value at 150%, it would make the duration actually longer than what it is on the page, which I was trying to figure out a practical purpose for that, and I couldn't think of one, but you never know. So there is a neat trick that you can do with a duplicated articulation in this manner. So, if there's something if there's a playback effect that you don't want to show up on the page, what you could do is, like in this case, duplicate the staccato and change the symbols to something blank, right? If you change that to a blank symbol, change this to a blank symbol. Usually in every font set, there's a series of blank symbols that you can choose. And then what you have is a blank articulation. Oops, I didn't set the flipped one right. There we go. What you have is a blank articulation that will allow you to, create a playback effect without actually having it appear on the page. Do the same with accents as well, So that is change duration. Now let's talk about change attack. And as I mentioned, this is only really useful on rolls. And so let me duplicate this and I'll show you this. So I'm creating a new roll. And now you'll see that change attack is selected. Now in this case, values as percentage is unchecked, and this is what we want. If we were to select values as percentage, the roll is going to be a different length depending on the value of the duration of the note you're putting it on. So a roll on a quarter note would be shorter than a roll on a whole note, which I guess that could make sense, but it's probably not what you want to do. With this unchecked, these numbers again become EDU, but the EDU numbers now will place the note either before or after the beat. That's what they mean by change the attack. So in this case, they have the bottom note value set to -256, which means that the bottom note is going to play 1/16th note before the beat, right? And then the top note value will be placed at 0, which will be on the beat. And again, all of the notes in between will have a value that go between -256 and 0. So if, for example, if you think that the roll is too quick, you could actually change this bottom note value to a higher number, or a higher negative value, I guess, to say -750. And now this additional roll that I created will actually be a longer roll, all right? So I'm going to illustrate this in the second measure here on my piano part. So I'm going to put the regular roll in on the first beat, and on the third beat, I'm going to put in this new roll, all right? Now remember, this has a -750 in that bottom note value, right? And watch what happens to the playback here. You can kind of hear how that second roll is a lot slower, right? It's kind of neat, right? There's other things that you can do with this. For example, if this bottom note value is 0, so that bottom note will be played on the beat, we can actually make this a positive number. Let's say we make this, maybe not 256, but let's make it 128. What will happen is this top note will actually be played after the beat. This is that third beat roll that I put in there. Right. Not totally useful, but it is possible to do that. And then also what we could do is actually, in order to create a roll going downwards, what we could do is put the negative number in the top value, -256, with the 0 in the bottom value, right? And we should get a downward roll now. Yeah. So that's how you do a downward roll with the change attack, all right? So that's change attack. I talked about duration, key velocity. One other thing I wanted to mention now, you may have noticed in the articulation library there are other types of articulations, right? You have a lot of ornaments, for example, and you have trills and all that stuff. And you know, these things will play back despite the fact that there is no playback effect on them. Actually, even I'm selecting the trill here, and you'll see that it has no playback effect, right? But if I select that, hold on, let's put it on the G, on the second chord here. If I select that and play it back, it will play that trill, right? The reason for this is because ornaments and tremolos as well are affected by human playback, right? So it's a different source for playing back those ornaments. In fact, if I were to turn human playback off, change that to none, you'll see that the trill won't play back, right? Stop finale. So there is a little bit of a difference in the where the playback source comes from for these articulations, right? There's only attack duration and key velocity available in the articulation designer. All the other playback functions come from human playback. And what human playback is doing is it's literally reading that trill and deciding what it should do with it. So, all right, so that is playback in the articulation designer. I hope that helps. Maybe you've learned some tricks with that. And come back for part 3, and we'll talk about the positioning of articulations. All right, thanks, and I'll see you soon.